Now, as the deepening drought crisis grips East Africa, the United Nations is holding an emergency meeting today in Rome, in Italy, to discuss the ways to address the famine-struck region. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization says the gathering is expecting ministers and senior representatives of its member countries, as well as aid groups and regional development banks. Now, the Horn of Africa is experiencing its worst drought in 60 years. More than 11 million people are in dire need of food, according to the United Nations. Australian Foreign Minister Kevin Rudd says failure by the international community to provide aid would mean the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Somalis, mostly children. The famine in Somalia is being made worse by the al-Qaeda-linked militant group Al-Shabaab, which is barring international aid workers from entering the country. An Al-Shabaab spokesperson says the UN is exaggerating the crisis for political reasons. And now joining us for more perspective on the situation in East Africa is Sonya Laurence, Chief of VOA's English to Africa programming and a veteran journalist who has covered previous drought on famine on the continent. Sonya, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Dimi.
Now, you covered the last famine in Somalia, 91, 92, and I remember you saying that once you've covered and seen the impact of famine, you can never recover from it. Can you walk us through that experience?
It's a terrible crisis. It is probably one of the worst humanitarian crises that can ever visit a people. We're looking at 10 to 12 million people at risk in the Horn of Africa of starvation. And what we see is a natural arc to this story. This shouldn't be a surprise to people who've been watching the situation. And at VOA, we're very careful to make sure that we're covering this story in a very professional, comprehensive manner. Essentially, what's happened is that with the drought, have come increasing alarm notices by aid agencies to say malnutrition rates are rising, vulnerability is increasing, people are beginning to eat the last of their seed stock, their livestock are dying, they're selling off their assets, and now what we see is out-migration of people desperate to seek food somewhere, and so we see Somalis pouring into the Kenyan camps looking for food. Unfortunately, as the situation has deteriorated, there comes a point, and it's a very serious and critical point, when aid agencies declare a famine. That is a word that is not lightly used. And now that they've declared that, we'll see what happens.
And as you rightly say, it's a word that is applied very, very cautiously after a lot of factors are considered.
Yes.
But at the same time, it seems to be a very controversial call, at least as is regarded by some aid agencies, and not necessarily that, also in particular in Somalia. Al-Shabaab is saying that it's being called to politicize the situation. Why is it so political to label a country as going through a famine?
Famine implies a certain level of responsibility. If we as the international community must respond to a famine, and if we as an international community say it should never happen again, then how did we get here, right? And we're very careful as a news agency to make sure that we don't use the word famine until the professionals and the aid agencies have a consensus that indeed we've passed a critical point of acute severe malnutrition, which we have. That indicator is usually about 30%. We're now in the 40 percentile rank of acute severe malnutrition among children and adults in Somalia. So by those standards, by that definition, there is a famine. And but why is it political? Because, as I mentioned, it implies some responsibility. It also implies a need to act. And what does that mean? That means that the government or militia in charge of the area is under moral obligation to allow aid agencies in to feed the people. It implies that the international community must raise the funds to pay for such an operation, which is an enormous logistical hurdle, and that everybody needs to be involved in making sure that the response is speedy, swift, and effective, and that it doesn't happen again, that vulnerability is addressed, because this story will go on. This is not just a story this week or this month. This is a story that will be on our radar for more than a year as we look at the arc of the story.
Now, Sonya, before you go, we only have a few seconds left. There's a very crucial meeting taking place, as we pointed out earlier, in Rome. A lot of aid agencies have attacked the international organizations, including the United Nations, for being very slow in responding to this crisis. Going back to the 1991, 92, when you covered Somalia, is this an ongoing argument about how a drought is forecast, but there's not action to prevent the impacts?
Yes, it is. In fact, this is the third major drought and famine in East Africa in the last 30 years. There was the drought and famine in Ethiopia in 1984, the drought and famine in Somalia in 91, 92, and now we're seeing it again. And so, you know, the best minds, we have economists, aid workers, governmental agencies looking at how can we predict a famine, how can we get a mechanism in place through the famine early warning system and other operations that are being developed, and prevent this from happening. But it's very complex.
It's very complex,
and it's difficult to assign blame. I think right now it's just a matter of responding quickly and getting the food in.
Thank you so much. Sonya,
Thank you.
Laurence Green, Chief of VOA's English to Africa programming, joining us here on In Focus.